And so Kathy, let's have a look and see now what we could possibly do to just adjust a few things on your design, perhaps to try and eliminate some of the push and pull problems that we experienced with it. So I'm just going to run through this and you'll see this fills from bottom to top with a tatami. The satin then, for the petals that are underneath, will fill from top to bottom, but the angle, instead of going straight across, is actually slightly angled in, and you'll see why in a moment, because these again, rather than having the angle going straight across, they're chevroned down. So we're doing exactly the same thing that we do with leaves, and the overlaps then, they're pulling against each other as they're working into each other rather than pulling against each other as they would if everything was going directly across at the same angle. And then this will flow from here down. And of course it does mean that this becomes our end point here, and the next piece that you decided to stitch was over here. That's fine, we'll have to walk around to it and start at the point. I think you started here and you actually flowed out, but that's the example there. Now the next thing that I actually wanted to look at, because it isn't just about the flow and the direction and the stitch angles, it's also about the density of the stitches, i.e. the space between the rows of the stitches. And let's have a look at some of the settings on this one here. So first of all, press stop. Let's just have a look at this. This one here, 0.5 with a stitch length of 3.5, 0.45 and a stitch length of 3.5. And when we look at the original, we've got a setting on that particular object of a density of 0.4 and a stitch length of 4 millimeters. Now 0.4 means there is a 0.4 of a millimeter gap between one run of stitching and the next time that stitching goes in that same direction. Now let's look at some of the satin stitch on here. Oops, let's try and get satin stitch rather than the travel line underneath. How is it? When you want to pick up the travel lines you can't. Okay, so this is one of the gold petals coming down here. This is the satin stitch on a 0.3 density. On the original we have a density of 0.39. Now slackening off the density means increasing the space between the rows of stitches. So that's why as this spacing number gets bigger, the space between the rows of stitches is getting bigger. Then that means that your density is slackening off. In other words, it's not as thick with stitches. And although there isn't a huge difference between 0.39 and 0.43, sometimes it can be a little bit of a difference between stitches piling up and having no space to go anywhere. So let's have a look at these. I think that's in the same situation here on the original 0.39, and then on the adjusted version here again managing to pick up a travel line, 0.46. Now one of the reasons why this is at 0.46 and is at a wider density than these ones is it's a smaller piece, it's in the background, and you really don't want to be piling too many stitches into a tiny little area. And that's also one of the reasons why I chose to put a tatami fill in here, just going upwards, because that space is so tiny. If we get the measure out and look at it, this is the largest one, and that gap there is 1.69 millimeters. So why would we want to cram in there some really tight satin stitch going from side to side that's pulling it in, when it actually comes to looking at the design? These gaps are so small. If we look at that one that you did, and then we look at the one that I did here, and we look at the original, these gaps are so small that really when we look at them in real life, we're not actually going to see that it's a satin stitch. And talking about small tiny little areas, maybe this just gives us the opportunity just to give ourselves a reminder that when we digitize, we often work at very high levels of magnification. I personally tend to work at 500 for the digitizing, and I think if you do this consistently, after a while you begin to get an idea, a sense of what size your overlaps need to be, where you lay your nodes down. But there is also a bit of a problem sometimes that arises, and that is that because we're working at such high levels of magnification, we actually forget that these areas are as small as they are. And so of course we work very, very hard at pulling in and covering every tiny little bit of it and making sure that even when we're in true view that it's all nicely covered. If it's covered this closely, when it's magnified at 500, then perhaps that's an indication that it may actually be a little tight when it's stitched out. But we don't know, because what we see on the screen is not what we get in real life, and the only way that we can do that is by looking at samples. And sometimes it's boring and sometimes it's difficult, but it makes, whoops-a-daisy, it makes the world of difference. And this, for example, here is, you've got to test your samples and you've got to find what works out on your machine and what doesn't. They're reference samples and they help. Don't just do reference samples when you're actually digitizing, as you did. Sample bits and pieces of your design, how one works with another, and it can make the world of difference and make life much, much easier. So let's go back to the design and let's have a look now at the circle. And by circle I actually mean the daisy, but it is actually nothing more than several rings or concentric circles which are laid down one after the other. And because of the way in which this particular graphic is, and we tend to want to digitize from the background to the foreground, the logic then tells us, if we take that line, that we'd have to come from the back, that one first, then this one which is underneath these, followed by this one, and then we'd fill in the center in the middle. And that's exactly what you did. And that logic is perfectly sound. However, when we are actually dealing with digitizing and putting embroidery stitches in there, the reality is that we lay down these stitches on the outside. So we've created a nice secure ring, and if we've done this going backwards and forwards, not only have we got the push going into the center, we've also got, as we travel around it here with the flow, as we fill in these objects, we're actually pushing a little bit of fabric going around here, and sometimes we can end up with a little bit of fluting here. Then, to just make sure that we can consolidate that, we then move into the next ring and we do the same again. We put down more stitches and we make this ring even more secure, and then we want to pile a whole load of stitches down into the center. So when we are working with circles, we have to be very, very careful that we try and keep the densities as low as we possibly can get away with. And it's always worth doing that. The other thing also, again, is looking at how can we make life simple. And I wonder if it would be possible to be able to digitize this by perhaps digitizing this center first, and then maybe digitizing this outer ring and then putting this on last, so that we're not pushing quite so much down into the center. And let's see if we could possibly avoid that. I think there are more than one way to do this, but let's see if we can achieve something with it. One little trick that we can do is, when we have something like a circle and we're filling in bits and pieces around it, what you can do is digitize every other one in one direction and then bring it back the other way. And now let's take a look and see if we can actually digitize some of the center of this before we actually lay down the stitches for some of the outside. So perhaps we could do this here. This in fact is one object. It's a satin stitch and then there are carved lines across it, and that saved having to digitize each of these tiny little pieces and then lay this one on top. And the effect looks largely similar once it's stitched out. Just something to bear in mind. And then obviously these come round stitched pretty much in a circle the same way as the green that you've just actually witnessed. And then next we can lay on the petals, and this is using the satin stitch as you did with the radial fill down here at the bottom. But on both of these the densities have been slackened off quite considerably compared with what they were on the original. And just because it's fun, we can then fill in the center. I didn't put the satin disc in, I've just put over the top here some tiny little stars. They're not the same colonial motifs that you used. they're just little stars. It's such a small space. And next perhaps we could bring in the underlay, just generally positioning there. I don't know if that's quite the right place, and we'll see what will happen there. And then finally, the crowning glory, we can actually add these petals in here. And it's tempting to say, well, what about all this detail down here? But even on a one-to-one here, they're so small, these little points, and that lovely radial fill effect works so well. But again, on these stitches here, the density's been pulled way back so that we're not trying to cram too many stitches in there. And even though we know that what we see on the screen isn't necessarily what we see stitched out, even just bringing this up to 300 for you to take a look at, you can see we don't lose the detail and this little zigzaggy effect of the petals and the little bit of carving in there. And if we go back and we compare that with the original, with these little zigzags here, I actually think it doesn't do a bad representation of it. Well, Kathy, I think I've gone on long enough, but I do sincerely hope that you found the points that I raised about looking at stitch angles and direction of flow and trying to design out in advance any problems that you might walk into when you're looking at doing your pathing plan, to take into consideration the objects themselves, not just travelling from one to another. And just watch out for those densities. So I really do hope, because I love this design, I hope that you do go back and make some of those adjustments and just see if they work for you with the lower densities, looking at some of the direction of travel. And if you do, I'd love to see the effect and whether it makes any difference and how you feel about it, more learning points. So thanks for joining in, it's been great and I thoroughly enjoyed doing this one.